And
Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for the Mansfield Dialogue on the election postmortem. To ensure that you see the speaker, please be sure to switch your Zoom view to speaker view rather than gallery view. To honor the intent of our dialogue series, we also encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat box. We also remind you to please mute your microphone throughout the conversation. This evening's moderator will be Mariah Thomas, a presidential leadership scholar at the University of Montana studying journalism and political science. As a junior in high school, she co-founded the nonprofit Helena Youth Against Gun Violence following the Parkland school shooting and was a lead organizer in the walkouts, the Helena March for Our Lives, and a candidate forum before the 2018 primary. She graduated as a Capital High School valedictorian in 2019. As a current sophomore at the University of Montana, Mariah has been active with Forward Montana in getting out the vote, as well as in the Davidson Honors College. She currently works as a sports reporter on the Montana Cayman and as an international research intern with the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. So we are sure to have a fascinating discussion tonight, and I'll turn it over to Mariah now to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening. In an election cycle that has felt so divisive, the importance of creating opportunities for dialogue, conversation, and learning cannot be understated. This is why the Mansfield Center is honored to host Montana Public Radio's Campaign Beat crew this evening as they analyze the results of last night's election and what they mean for the future of politics and governing in Helena and Washington. Sally Mauk is News Director Emerita of Montana Public Radio and currently hosts Campaign Beat, a weekly political analysis program on MTPR. Prior to her journalism career, Mauk was a wilderness ranger on the Kootenai National Forest. She is a University of Kansas graduate with a degree in Western European history and German language and literature, which have nothing to do with wilderness or journalism. Holly Michels is the state house and political reporter for Lee Newspapers in Helena. She covers everything from the legislature to state agencies, campaigns, and more. Michels graduated from University of Montana School of Journalism and has worked at the Ravalli Republic, Montana Standard, Billings Gazette, and Helena Independent Record. Robert Saldin is the Director of Ethics and Public Affairs at UM's Mansfield Center. Never Trump, co-authored with Stephen Teles, is his third book. Saldin's work has also appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New Republic, National Affairs, The American Interest, and elsewhere. I'll hand it over to Sally Mauk to start off this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Mariah, and thank you to everyone who's logged in this evening. And I think I want to start with the question that I got asked a lot today. And the question is, what the heck happened with Democrats? They got whooped. Rob, what happened?
Yeah, hi again, Sally. Sally and I were in the studio last night till 11 o'clock or so. So look, well, I think a few things happened. One, just to start with, Donald Trump did a heck of a lot better than he was projected to do, according to the polls. This, of course, is a national story, but we certainly felt it here in Montana. So Trump won last night by 16, and that's not 20 like he did 4 years ago, but it's pretty darn close. It's certainly closer than I would have thought he'd get running this time against Joe Biden, who I think is a little bit of a better fit for Montana than Hillary Clinton was. But in any event, it's Trump just did way better than he was projected, right? A lot of the polls had him, running 6-7 points ahead of Biden in Montana. So 16 is much better. So I think you start there, and then Sally, last night in the studio, as you know, I was keeping a real close eye on how the Democratic candidates were doing relative to John Tester just 2 years ago in his successful Senate campaign against Rosendale. And, it became pretty clear from the get-go that all of the Democrats, including Steve Bullock, were just down across the board. And it was just a pretty consistent trend. And, just to take a couple of examples, Yellowstone County, biggest county in the state, Billings, that is a county that Democrats don't need to win, but they do need to run close, right? And so, we were talking last night, Sally, saying, if these Democrats are hanging in, within 2-3 percentage points, something like that, I'd say that puts them in a pretty good spot. Well, they didn't even get close to that. It was double digits. Very similar thing in Cascade County. Cascade is kind of one of those bellwether counties, home to Great Falls. John Tester carried Cascade 2 years ago by 6 points, but last night, Greg Gianforte carried it by 16. Steve Daines carried it by 12. So you just aren't going to win as a Democrat in Montana if that's where you're at. And then I think the other thing, the final thing I'd point to on this is just that Republicans, I think, were successful in nationalizing this election in Montana. This was a goal of the Republican candidates. I think we saw it most clearly in probably the Senate campaign. All those ads we saw coming in, trying to link Bullock to Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and so on, right? That's kind of what we mean by nationalizing it, right? Making it about which party is going to be in control of Congress, tying it to the presidential race. Republicans want to do that because that works to their advantage. And what we saw from the Democratic candidates is they tried to keep the focus on Montana stuff, on local stuff. And I just don't think it worked for Democrats this year. It's harder to do that, I think, in a presidential year, particularly probably a presidential year where emotions are really high and there's just high level of engagement and commitment to one side or the other. It's tough to divorce yourself from that. And then I think the other thing is, in the case of Steve Bullock, it's harder to do that, to keep the focus on local issues, Montana issues, and have it not be nationalized and all that. It's harder to do that when you're running for federal office, right? Probably a little easier to do that when you're just going to be governor in Helena. But when you're running to be in Congress, it's just inevitable that people are going to look at that and read into that. Well, what does this mean for control of the chamber? Who's going to be majority leader, and whatnot? And so, I think that really worked to the advantage of Republicans last night.
Mm-hmm. Well, Holly, I think I was not as surprised that Republicans swept the top 3 offices, in that the polls did show that the Republicans in those races always led, but they showed that it was by 1 or 2 points. So the surprise to me was the margin of victory. I mean, it was double digits in almost every single race, and especially in the Senate race with Bullock and Daines. I mean, Bullock lost by 10 points. That's an embarrassment, really, for him, someone as well-known and as popular a governor as he has been, to lose by that big a margin. What do you think? The margins were, I think, the biggest surprise.
Yeah, I think that was surprising for people on both sides, both parties last night, and for people like us who've been watching the polls pretty closely. Talked to some political analysts today who were saying that what they think was going on with the polling there is that polling was reaching people who are likely voters that we know are going to show up, and that a lot of people who showed up last night weren't in that calculus. I talked to some Republicans at their watch party last night for Daines and Gianforte, excuse me, and they really reached out, they said, to inactive voters and people who hadn't cast a ballot in a long time, and that really, I think they felt like that helped turn out and helped drive up those margins too. And I was just looking, like you said, double digits. That Senate race, House and Governor, both 12-point margins there. Secretary of State down ballot was a 20-point race, which was a pretty decisive margin there. I think Office of Public Instruction is one of those Tier B races that both Democrats and Republicans I talked to thought that Democrats had a pretty good chance of winning that, and that was still an 8-point race. So, I think those margins were pretty huge. Like you said, turnout in Montana, it was the most votes that have ever been cast. I think the last I looked percent turnout wise was about 79%. So it's a lot more people voting. And like we've talked about before, there's just more Republicans generally in Montana. So that favors them with high turnout. And then also it sounds like Republicans really tried to get people to show up. And like Rob was saying, there's counties, Flathead County or Valley County had really big margins for Republicans like they always do, but Republicans did better in the county they always win, and Democrats didn't do as well in the counties that they typically do well in, like Missoula County, those places.
Right. Rob, I think a lot of people or a lot of Democrats thought that they would maybe benefit from a heavy youth vote, that they thought young people would turn out to pass the marijuana initiatives, which did pass easily. And so there probably were a lot of young people voting. We don't know the breakdown yet by age, but it didn't obviously turn things for Democrats. And so that's one constituency that they were counting on, that either the young people didn't turn out in the numbers they hoped, or they didn't vote Democrat. What do you think?
Yeah, you know, that's always one of these things that Democrats put a lot of their hopes on, and it never quite works out. You know, this is one of the old stories about American politics and elections. Young people don't turn out. Now, my guess is that turnout among young people is going to look pretty decent once we have those numbers, just because turnout across the board was so strong, but probably not quite where it needed to be, obviously. You know, I think the other thing, and you suggested it, Sally, but it's, you know, there's no iron law that says young people are always going to vote for Democrats. And in fact, you know, I think a lot of people assume that, and for good reason. If you look at, you know, public opinion data on young people, they do tend to be more liberal or progressive. If you go down through policy issues, oftentimes they clearly line up a little better with Democrats. But when you're in a culturally conservative state like Montana, that doesn't necessarily work out. And also, if you just look to history, you can find counterexamples pretty easily. You know, Ronald Reagan, for one, he was pretty popular back in the 80s among young people. So again, there's just no iron law that young people are always going to vote Democratic, even though we kind of often assume that, and Democrats place a lot of their hopes on that. And so, you know, I think that's what's going on. And in terms of the marijuana initiative, as you note, that did pass easily. I just think, you know, we talked about this a few weeks ago on the show, but my sense of that is that has just become so much more accepted over the last several years. And Montana's kind of hopped back and forth on that issue over the last, you know, 10, 15 years. But now I think it just doesn't have the kind of controversial aspect to it that it used to. And I also suspect, and I did see at least one poll on this, that a lot more Republicans were in support of that than I think a lot of people might think. That is not just something that appeals to young people. It's not just something that appeals to Democrats and progressives. There are plenty of Republicans, I think, kind of tapping into that libertarian feel of the state, who also look at an issue like that and say, you know, yeah, sure, fine on marijuana, and also I'm voting a straight ticket R.
I want to get back to the messaging that the campaigns used, and you alluded to some of them, Rob, but I think, Holly, there were probably two main messages, right? And two big issues in this election, the economy and the pandemic / healthcare. And Republicans really, like especially Greg Gianforte and Steve Daines, really hit the economic message hard. And Democrats, Steve Bullock and Mike Cooney and Kathleen Williams, they hit the healthcare issue really hard. And the idea of maybe losing health care if the Affordable Care Act is repealed and so on. So does the outcome of the election mean that the economic message is what resonated the strongest, more than the healthcare issues? What do you think, Holly?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the really strong Republican margins we saw show that that economic message was what people wanted to hear. What's interesting to me is in looking at healthcare, Democrats, and talking to them through this race, had polling that showed that that was a winning issue for them. And like you said, protections for people with pre-existing conditions so they can't be denied healthcare by insurance companies. That's something that's popular with people of all political stripes. And Democrats really, I think, had a pretty specific argument they could articulate really well, especially Bullock with Daines, about votes that Daines had taken to repeal the Affordable Care Act, where those protections are codified. So I think it was just a really specific argument that Bullock could make. He also has a really, I think, strong record on healthcare in Montana, expanding Medicaid here. We've heard since the 2019 legislature and the ramp up to that, Bullock sort of run this PR campaign about Medicaid expansion in Montana and why it's important and why it was successful to continue that in 2019 in the legislature. So it felt like there was this 2-year period where Steve Bullock had really been talking about why he was the best person for healthcare in Montana. And then, with Daines and the economy, it was a lot about trying to reopen things after COVID to get the economy going again. And it just felt like there were a lot more general arguments. There weren't a lot of specific things in that race that Daines was talking about the economy, but political people I talked to today were saying maybe there's just fatigue with the virus and people liked, maybe a more positive message of just, better jobs, more money in their pockets, that sort of thing. I think in the governor's race, interesting too, sort of the same, Mike Cooney articulated a really clear, I think, way he would address the pandemic. He talked about, I would be continuing a lot of what the Bullock administration has done, which he's a part of. He talked about he would maybe even take the mask mandate a little further, extending it to all counties regardless of active cases. On, same with pre-existing conditions, he talked about support for codifying those protections in state law if something like the case before the US Supreme Court were to either strike down the ACA fully or partially and those protections were to go away. So I think Cooney was really articulating on specific arguments there. And Gianforte, like we've heard since his first governor bid in 2016, he's the business guy. We've heard him say that many, many times. He really campaigns on wanting better paying jobs from Montana, wanting people to move elsewhere to find jobs that pay well, looking at loosening regulations. He's talked about cutting taxes, both for businesses and for individuals, property taxes. And he did have this Montana comeback plan that he did and campaigned on, and it had in there, there were some specifics on how he would accomplish that, but also just, it was kind of more of a broad strokes type document. I think that was a message, like we were talking about, COVID fatigue might be something that was weighing on people and they just wanted to talk about maybe getting things back going, the economy, that sort of stuff. So I think how that shook out is interesting. I think Democrats thought it was going to play a lot better for him than it did. And I think we're going to see some pretty serious changes in the way now Montana is responding to the pandemic with the legislature. I talked to lawmakers today who are saying, they want to come in, they want to look at maybe limiting some of the ways a governor can respond in a pandemic without having to consult the legislature first. Also looking at ways, local health boards are making a lot of decisions for their counties, and maybe Republicans would like to see those decisions instead having to be passed by county commissioners who are elected. So I think we're going to see the real life implications play out from where people were thinking about economy versus healthcare when we go into the legislative session soon.
Right. Well, I do want to get to the consequences of the election and how that might play out, which you just touched on, Holly. But
Hey, Sally?
yeah,
sorry. Hey, Sally, maybe if I could just interject quickly.
Sure.
Holly, I agree with everything you said. The one little asterisk I would put on that, though, is that the political scientist in me, I guess, just sometimes wants to add this point that, a lot of times when we talk about issues, kind of the underlying assumption is that people have preferences on issues. Say, okay, I want Medicaid expanded, for instance. Now let me go out and find the candidates who support that position, right? That's kind of the framework which we approach issues. But there's a lot of political science research that indicates that for a lot of people, that actually comes second. They have their attachment to a team. I was mentioning earlier, characterized Montana as a culturally conservative state. And that was kind of what I was getting at, right? People have an attachment to, say, Trump. And that's not because of the issue stances that Trump takes, right? Rather, it's in fact what frequently happens, that they like Trump, or they see themselves as Republican or Democrat, and then they see what positions the individuals or the parties that they identify with are taking, and then adopt those issue positions. So it doesn't always work kind of in a straight line the way we sometimes think on issues.
Well, Rob, I'm sorry, Holly, do you want to add something? Go ahead. No?
Oh,
Yeah.
no, I was just going to say other political analysts I talked to today were saying similar to what Rob said, and just that they're seeing that increasingly so, that as people become more polarized and they feel like this is maybe the election where that hit Montana, where it's been happening elsewhere, that you really did see that team mentality where you're voting, Trump at the top of the ticket. And, like we used to, we have talked about a lot before, ticket splitters in Montana, but this year kind of a move, it looks like, away from that.
Mm-hmm. Well, along those lines, Rob, you mentioned Montanans having a libertarian streak, and part of what a couple of my sources pointed out today is that they think this vote, this election, was a reaction to the mask mandate, that the anti-maskers turned out in full force, and that goes along with, don't take my guns away, that kind of messaging as well, which ties into the support for Trump that you mentioned. Do you think that it could be boiled down that simply, that a lot of the Republican support was in that kind of Montana anti-government streak that is always underneath, but maybe doesn't come out quite as blatantly as it did in this election? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically right. And I think Holly kind of nailed it when she brought up the polarization point, right? I mean, I think that's kind of what fueled a lot of this. And in terms of the mask thing, I mean, that just became, that's kind of a classic example, actually. That became so politicized. In a lot of other countries, wearing or not wearing a mask is not a political statement. But, and I don't think it started out that way here. And you could almost imagine an alternative universe in which, Trump was the one promoting masks, right? He's apparently kind of a germaphobe and doesn't like sick people to be around him, even just people with a cold and whatnot, not. But so, I mean, you could imagine that having played out in a very different way. But in any event, when it did become so politicized, right? I think you saw the kind of reaction that we've seen. And again, to go back to my previous point, I don't think people had a strong view on wearing or not wearing a mask. And then they liked President Trump more, or the Republicans more, because they were perceived as being less pro-mask or anti-mask, or however you want to characterize it. It all feeds into this kind of team mentality that goes along with polarization, right? Polarization fuels that. And, Holly is exactly right when to bring up the split ticket thing too, right? This has been a hallmark of Montana politics, but in a polarized climate, that goes away, and people go with their team.
I want to briefly, Holly, go back to the Senate race, and this kind of ties into talking about messaging as well. And Governor Bullock, of course, ran for the presidency before he joined the Senate race. And I think some analysts are now saying, that probably hurt his Senate run. he had to go farther to the left in his presidential run to try to get the Democratic nomination. So he came out for more stringent gun control than he ever had as governor, for example. And then in this Senate race, that was brought up repeatedly, that one of many issues where they felt like he had betrayed Montanans in a way. And then he also got into the Senate race late because of his presidential run. So that had to be a factor in him losing the Senate race. What do you think?
I think so. You're right that we heard many times, which I couldn't even think of how many times, but Senator Daines talk about his rating A+ from the NRA and Bullock's F. And it's because of stances like that he took. The governor has defended that stance, saying that as governor, he's had to lower the flags many times in the state for mass shootings, and he wants to be able to start a dialogue around that. But we know this from many elections. The Second Amendment is a pretty darn big deal in Montana. If you think about the number of ads each cycle that feature guns, it's a pretty common theme that comes up. So I do think that hurt him in some of the stances he had to take. I think the other one that came up is talking about the idea of packing the Supreme Court. That's another thing that Bullock, if I'm remembering right, expressed something, that he would be open to that idea during his presidential bid. And he repeated that in a debate between him and Daines. But that's something that he maybe not would have been so vocal on if he wasn't in that presidential race and doing all those interviews. And the other thing that I'd be curious, what you and Rob think about if this hurt him much, but he did say many times he didn't want to run for the Senate. I think I probably did 3 or 4 interviews with him just about that before, during, and then even after he dropped out of the presidential race. He was still insisting he did not want to run for that seat. And I remember early on, we saw a lot of Daines messaging that, hey, this guy didn't want the job. He told us he didn't want to be in the Senate. And that sort of seemed to fade away, come back and, kind of on and off through the race. It seemed like, to me, if I'm remembering right, it was a much bigger deal that Daines' team and the Montana Republican Party was really hammering early on. But he did say for a long time he just didn't even want the job. So I think that probably played a role. I just hadn't heard it as much toward the end of the race, but it was a big part of the start of the race.
Yeah. For sure, he was never coy about not wanting to be. He even said, I don't want to be a U.S. Senator. I'm more an executive, not a legislator. And I remember I interviewed him once and he said, no, I don't want to run for the Senate. And I said, just so we're clear, you don't want to run for the Senate. And he repeated it. And so I believed him. And I think maybe a lot of voters believed him too when he did run for the Senate, that his heart maybe wasn't as in it as it should be. I want to talk now about the effects of the election, and Holly talked a little bit about what might happen, for example, with a pandemic under a Gianforte administration and a legislature that's dominated by conservative Republicans who have been very vocal about the way that Governor Bullock handled the pandemic and saying they don't want to do it that way, and they are not as convinced as some Democrats of the seriousness of the pandemic and what government should do or not do about it. So Rob, I think we're going to see some real changes in terms of that, just one example of one issue that's going to be dealt with very differently under the new administration.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, first, I guess the most obvious thing is that this is just an enormous accomplishment for the Montana Republican Party, right? We've basically had a generation now with a dynamic in which you have a Republican legislature, or at least one house of the legislature, but Democratic governors. 8 years of Bullock, 8 years with Brian Schweitzer before that. And the Republicans have been focused on winning this particular seat, I think more than any other, for years now, right? And they've been frustrated that they haven't gotten it before, and they have just been focused like a laser beam on this one, and they won. And I would say also beyond that, it's not just a win for Montana Republicans. It's a win for a particular wing of the Montana Republican Party, and that's the conservative wing. You know, not only Gianforte, but some of the other candidates. And, you know, you could look at, or I guess we could speculate about whether if Tim Fox, the Attorney General, who also ran in the Republican primary, if he had gotten the nomination, you know, maybe he would have done even better. But Gianforte wins by 12. Right. So, I mean, Gianforte did plenty well enough. So a big win for the Republicans, big win for the conservative faction within the Republican Party. And yeah, it is gonna change the dynamic. I mean, you know, we've had basically divided government in Montana for 16 years, for eight regular legislative sessions. That is going to come to an end. The Republicans are going to have strong majorities in the legislature, and they're going to have a governor eager to receive their bills. So it's going to look a lot different in Helena, and certainly the pandemic is one place where we see a real contrast. Gianforte talks about personal responsibility. There are Republican proposals to limit the ability of local officials and the governor to place restrictions, right? We could also look to taxes. I'm sure we'll be seeing some proposals for tax cuts, holding the line on spending, which doesn't necessarily mean fewer dollars being spent, but when you factor in inflation and whatnot, right, I think it could very well amount to the same thing. Cuts on regulations for a more business-friendly environment. You could think about education, proposals for what Republicans like to call school choice, charter schools and whatnot. And then the other big one, and we've seen this come up in a lot of recent legislative sessions, social issues, in particular abortion. Bullock and Schweitzer vetoed a number of bills in this area, and we can certainly expect Gianforte to sign those. So yeah, all in all, it's a major shift in Helena.
Well, for sure. And in the past, Holly, under the Governor Bullock and Governor Schweitzer, there have been moderate Republicans who've worked with Democrats. So even though Republicans have controlled the House and the Senate, some Democratic priorities got passed because of these moderate Republicans, the so-called Solutions Caucus, working with them. But with a supermajority in the House and Senate for Republicans, what do you think is going to be the evolution of the Solutions Caucus, some of which are not in the legislature, actually didn't get reelected, but will there be that kind of coalition is something to wonder about. And if not, that means that, you know, whatever Republicans want passed and whatever Democrats want passed is going to be really different.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see. I'm not going to pretend to know or be able to predict how that's going to turn out, but I talked to Representative Lou Jones, who is a leader in that caucus, and he's also kind of the main architect of the state budget each session. And he was saying, he thinks that that caucus, he framed it around looking for solutions. That's where they draw their name from. And he did say that, I think there will be different solutions that are more friendly to a Republican governor at the end of the road. So I think we're going to see some changes there. One thing I'm really curious what the Solutions Caucus about is through, they have taken, like you said, sided with Democrats, passed Medicaid expansion, and then continued it in the last session. But they've also been voting with the further right of their party on some of those social bills, like Rob just talked about, the abortion bills, those sorts of things. So I wonder how that looks. I talked to some Democrats today who, they're saying that it's going to be a rough session. They aren't trying to pretend like last night isn't something that it wasn't, and doesn't show them what those huge margins that they're looking at. But they've been in the minority this whole time in the legislature and have been able to get things accomplished. I think they're hopeful there. I think pre-K is still something that they'd like to push. I know Gianforte said that's not top priority for him, so that might not have as much. It also didn't pass with a Democrat in the governor's office and with more Solutions Caucus members. So be curious to see how that goes. But I do think, Rob's right that we're going to have a pretty dramatically different session. And then also just how the session is going to be conducted with COVID, I think is going to change how a lot of it looks and feels too. So yeah, I think it's going to be pretty interesting. I mean, I think the Solutions Caucus group pretty typically is, dominant voice in the budget decisions. And that's just going to be with COVID and a probably very tight budget. I know the state's going into this in a pretty good economic picture with, full rainy day fund, a full fire fund, but COVID has devastated the state budget and everybody's expecting it to be really hard, especially in the second year of the biennium. So I think a lot of Gianforte's priorities, like what Rob was talking about with the hold on spending, Jones was saying that, we'll probably have a likely hold on, how much money we can spend anyway, because revenues are going to be so probably pretty darn dire. So, that might also change what's available for tax cuts. And Republicans I've talked to are really eager to be able to do a lot of those things Rob laid out, to be able to convince voters, you got us here, we're delivering on the promises, to be able to set up a second term for Gianforte. So how COVID kind of changes what they can work on, I think is going to be interesting to watch too.
Yeah, well, for sure, they must feel that they have a mandate from the public with the margins that they won by, right?
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Holly.
I was just gonna say that was exactly what Republicans I talked to today for a story I worked on were saying, is this is a mandate. This is a message to us from voters. We see up and down the ballot how decisive our wins were, and we feel like that tells us what our marching orders are, what we're going to do in the session. So they definitely do see it as a mandate for sure.
Well, Rob, as you said, this is a huge accomplishment for the Republican Party, and our old colleague Chuck Johnson researched that the last time one party won everything like Republicans did this time was in 1936, when Democrats swept all the offices on riding the coattails of FDR's election. So it is an amazing accomplishment. I think the question is, Montana's red now, there's no question about it, but is that a permanent state? What are Democrats going to be aiming to do? Or is this a trend where Montana is going to be more like its neighbors, Idaho and Wyoming and the Dakotas, which are solidly red and have been for some time? Is Montana going to be red from now till the foreseeable future and beyond? What do you think, Rob?
I think it's pretty grim for Democrats, and there are probably lots of reasons, but one of the reasons, this is the second round in a row where they've lost all of those second tier races, right? Attorney General, Secretary of State, and so on, and that just kills your bench. So you look out there, and they're just, this is one of the problems when you have a big loss like this. It wipes out all the rising stars in the party, and it takes away their platform. So it just gets harder and harder the farther you go. But the Idaho example, I think, is a good one. I grew up in Idaho, and back when I was a kid, there were still Democrats in Idaho. Frank Church. I don't personally. I was alive, but I don't have any memories of. I was too young to remember Frank Church. But he was there. He got taken out in 1980. Big wave election for Republicans with Ronald Reagan. But even after Church, there was still Cecil Andrus, a 4-term governor. He's kind of like Idaho's version of Mike Mansfield, maybe something like that. A huge figure in the state. But when he was done, and I think he finished up in 94, maybe, when he left the scene, the bottom just totally fell out for the Democratic Party. And I've felt for a long time that we've been watching kind of a slow process of that kind of thing play out. It didn't all happen at once like it did in Idaho. And there are some important differences between Idaho and Montana too. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that in a few years Montana is going to look like Idaho, but I do think that what we've been seeing in Montana over a number of cycles is that once you have these kind of larger than life figures leave the stage. So I'm thinking here, Pat Williams, Max Baucus, these people who develop their own brand that in a lot of ways was able to overcome party identification. Well, when you strip that away and replace those people with just a generic Democrat, people revert back to their partisan identities. And of course, the whole polarization thing just feeds on that. But we've seen, I mean, for a long time, Republicans have had a big advantage in the state legislature and at the presidential level. Those are the ones that are, I think, most prone to getting into that R versus D mentality. And then the other tell, I think, is that, think back over the last 8, 10, 12 years, right? When Democrats have been winning statewide, it's an absolute white knuckler, right? All of John Tester's victories, he's had 3 of them and he's won, and that's the most important thing, but they have always been tight, always super close. Same with Bullock. His 2 runs for governor were both very close. Meanwhile, when Republicans are winning statewide, it's a blowout, right? It's the same kind of margins we saw last night. 10 points, 12 points, sometimes even higher, right? All of that suggests to me that that Republicans have been in a stronger position, that this has been more of a red state than a purple state for a number of years now. But I think we really saw that come home and play out last night.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point, is that this wasn't a sudden change. There has been a gradual reddening of the state for some years now, and this was just kind of the culmination of that, for sure. The 3 of us could go on and on and on, but I think people who have logged in probably have some questions for us. So I'm going to turn it back over to Mariah if she wants to throw some questions at us.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like there's a bunch of really great questions in the chat. I think that a good place to start off would maybe be, we were talking about Republicans and Democrats and, whether Democratic legislators will be able to make a comeback at all. A question from Facebook asked, do you guys think that Democratic legislators will be able to accomplish anything at all in this 2021 legislative session?
I think the opposing party doesn't want to be totally vicious. And so I think Republicans will work with Democrats to pass something that isn't anathema to Republicans. That's my thought. I think it's a bad look if a legislature doesn't try to work across the aisle, even if it's a token effort. I think it looks very bad for the party. So I would expect Democrats would get something. I don't think it's going to be anything too major or too dear to their heart. What do you think, Holly?
I think you're right on that. I mean, I think maybe you look at places where the 2 parties can find something they agree on, maybe some access bills for public land, opening up access or something like that. In places where Democrats and Republicans aren't that far apart, I do think those places still exist. Like covering the legislation or the legislature, a lot of the coverage that gets the most attention is where there's really big clashes between the parties. But there are bills, you see every session that pass with 99, 100 votes. There are those things that go through each session. So I think it is a lot of the bills, like Sally said, it's not the big priorities. It probably won't be pre-K. I know there've been some discussions Democrats have been looking at, changing certain taxes that haven't been updated in decades, as long as I've been alive, things like that. But I don't think we're going to see that this year by any means. So I think there are places where we do see, consensus in a regular session, and we probably will continue to hear. But I think Sally's right. It's not the big ticket priority stuff for Democrats.
Yeah, I think you 2 nailed it. Just with another one, Mariah.
I guess kind of tying in with that public lands comment that you made, Holly, someone else from Facebook said that Dames ran on protection of public lands and asked, how will this play with Gianforte's priorities as governor?
I think Holly could answer that.
I'm not sure if I understand the question super clearly. I mean, I guess I can talk a little bit. Do you guys have any advice on what you think it's asking, or?
Well, I think the questioner wants to know if Gianforte is aligned with Senator Daines in terms of access to public lands and that kind of thing. And I think they probably are quite in tune with each other on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Holly.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You think a lot of people I talked to today were saying that they felt like public lands, it has been a winning argument for Democrats in the past, and they're saying they're feeling like Republicans were able to get this message across that they were good candidates on public lands too. I do think Gianforte and Daines are pretty aligned there. I think it's always a battle. I think with the land board seats up, we're going to see some interesting maybe differences there with an entirely Republican land board and Governor Gianforte setting the agenda for that land board. I have heard some scuttlebutt about the Habitat for Montana program and maybe efforts there to not have requirement that the components of the deals that project do have public land access component, public access components to them. So I think that's something that people who are concerned about it, Governor Gianforte, have been trying to talk about that issue. Yeah, I mean, I think probably with the state level, it'd just be the land board and having a Republican set the agenda for that, because we have had the Republicans in all the other seats on the land board under Bullock, but shift at the person setting the agenda on the top there. And looking at the legislature, there's been a high-profile state Supreme Court decision that came out of the land board. So I mean, I think there's room for things to shift there, but I don't know. I'm curious to see. I mean, I think in the Senate race, it was a huge issue. Bullock had pretty high-profile court win, getting Penley out of BLM, and that was it seemed like a pretty big deal in that race near the end. And Daines really didn't ever have to talk about Penley much because that lawsuit kind of settled the nomination issue. But I think even that didn't push Bullock across the line. So yeah, it would be interesting for sure, both I think at state and federal level.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions in here about the election itself. I guess the first one, both Jack and Art in the chat asked questions about the attack ads, the political attack ads that were running throughout the campaign. And they wanted to know how much those targeted political attack ads affected the election in our state.
I think, yeah, Rob, you're the expert.
I think at some point, the advertising stops being very effective. It, when you're so saturated in it, you're just kind of hearing the same messages again and again and again. So it can have a kind of reinforcing effect. And I do think we heard plenty of negative hits on all of the major candidates. And you do, I mean, I at least certainly hear people, when these names come up, you hear people repeat some of these things. So they do stick. And I think they do really help shape our views, the public's views of these candidates. It's always, again, kind of the political scientist in me always comes back to these things. There's always a kind of chicken and the egg problem here, right? I mean, do you decide that you don't like candidate X because you saw some negative ads, or do you explain the reason why you don't like candidate X using the rationales that you see in the ads, right? So there's always a little bit of that going on. But still, look, I mean, for especially voters who don't pay a huge amount of attention to politics, that's where some of those negative hits really can make a difference. So it's not going to sway people who eat and breathe this stuff. But for people who who largely ignore politics and just maybe tune in at the last minute, you know, that's where that negative advertising can really move some people.
Yep.
Someone else asked in the chat, what impact did the different approaches to in-person campaigning that Democrats and Republicans took have on the outcome of the elections?
I'll take that. I think not being able to do retail politicking hurt Democrats in this election. I think it is important to get out and meet folks and schmooze with them. And you know, there were rallies sort of held around the state, but nothing like it would have been in a sort of normal election year. And it's true that Republicans weren't as strict about their gatherings, and that probably did, I think, help them a bit. And I think if you're an underdog in a race, which Democrats were on the whole, it's even more important to get out there and meet and greet and have people get a sense of who you are in a very personal sense. And in Montana, it really matters because we're such a low population state. I mean, a lot of candidates can meet a lot of Montanans, and that makes a lasting impression, even if it's like a 5-minute handshake and chat. I think that goes a long way. And so I think it's one of many factors that did not help Democrats, is to have to campaign during a pandemic. Holly, do you have anything that? Yeah.
One thing I was just thinking about is, you know, Danes and then Gianforte, and we've covered this in elected office, haven't really held those in-person big town hall type events that, you know, we see John Tester do from time to time. And I think, you know, talking to people about this race, they're saying it was kind of set up, especially for Gianforte, really well with his ability to self-finance and just flood the airwaves and mailboxes with advertising for a candidate who hasn't been as comfortable in an elected office, going out, meeting with people, doing all of that, to be able to campaign, you know, through airwaves, through mailboxes. That kind of was suited for him pretty well. I think, like you said, retail politics is huge for Democrats. And I went to a handful of events that Democrats had, and they were all, you know, they were doing those drive-in events around the state where people would come in cars, and you hear a candidate talk, but it's not that really direct interaction. It just feels different. And then some pretty small gatherings, you know, right before the election, get out the vote rallies and stuff like that, and just so much smaller. And Republicans did have those big in-person events. He was one up in the Flathead with Trump Jr. right before the vote. You think those probably draw people who are probably going to vote Republican anyway, but maybe help make sure that they actually do cast a ballot. So yeah, I think it would have affected it for sure, and definitely hurt Democrats.
Switching a little bit from the races between Democrats and Republicans to a legislative referendum, Brian asked in the chat, with LR 130 passing, the measure to remove local government's authority to regulate the carrying of permitted concealed weapons, do you foresee this setting a precedent of less local authority?
I don't have a good answer for that. My guess is yes, but that's all. Yeah. Holly?
I don't know. I can take a stab at, just from remembering through the legislature, a lot of the debate that at least I was covering and following at the time, and then with the issue back in Missoula, was really specific to firearms. It really felt like that was kind of the centerpiece of the legislation, you know, the lawsuit from Missoula, and then the legislation that brought that referendum. So for me, it felt like it was a lot about firearms and not getting at local control on other issues. But I mean, it does change the scene there. So I don't know. Rob, do you have any thoughts?
Well, it's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about it in that sense, although, I mean, a couple things that do spring to mind. I mean, one I mentioned earlier, and that is that one of the Republican priorities, it sounds like, for the next legislative session is to take away some of the powers that local officials have to address the pandemic. I mean, another thing that occurs to me is that there are a lot of, or maybe not a lot, but there are some cities in the state that would like to have a local option tax, like some of the resort communities in the state. I know Whitefish has one, and I believe Big Sky does as well. You know, I know like Missoula, a lot of people in Missoula would love to have the ability to do that as well. But that's something that the Republican Party doesn't like. You can see some parallels there in other areas. And of course, you know, some of that stuff's always struck me as a little strange because, or at least inconsistent on an ideological level, because Republicans, I mean, typically like devolved government, right? Government closer to the people. And yet we do see a little bit of a trend here, at least in regard to those three issues of wanting to take away power of local areas and, you know, keep control in Helena.
There's a couple questions here that are kind of looking more towards the future, mostly for the Democratic Party in our state. A viewer from Facebook asked, who are the rising stars of the Democratic Party in our state? And do they have any strong prospective candidates on their bench for the next races?
All the rising stars got beat last night. You know, that's why, you know, I mentioned that earlier, but, you know, you especially look at that Senate race. That just has to be really demoralizing for Democrats. I mean, they got by far the best candidate, you know, the most popular politician in the state, according to most polling, a successful two-term governor. You know, Montanans know Bullock, they like Bullock, and still loses by 10, right? And once you get past Bullock, I don't know. And that's, again, I mentioned this earlier, but that's again why getting swept for 2 cycles in a row now in those second tier offices, you know, those are the traditional stepping stones to running for governor or for Congress. And that just means that you know, unless you have some kind of celebrity candidate drop in, which occasionally there's chatter of something like that, or you know, bringing out some of the greatest hits, like Schweitzer getting back into the game or something like that. It's hard. And so I'm not sure who the rising stars are. Holly, you know, Holly has an office there in the Capitol. Maybe she has a better read on some of the rising stars in the party who might not be kind of household names yet.
Yeah, I mean, my answers, if last night turned out much differently, would have been Rafe Graybill and probably Shane Morjo. You know, Graybill comes from this pretty incredible pedigree for Montana politician, and you know, from everything we've been able to observe his career as a very talented attorney, and watching him on the campaign trail, he's really good at campaigning. And I think that's another candidate that really got hurt by not being able to have those events, because he's an attorney, he's good at rallying up a crowd, you know, getting people to believe his argument. And I think he would have done better, you know, in a non-COVID year. And I think we're going to see him back again. Morjo, Democratic lawmaker from Missoula, just watching him over this campaign, he's really been able to get together a really good stump speech. By the end of it, I saw an event here in Helena that they did, I think last Saturday, and just watching his evolution through this campaign, he's become a pretty good candidate, I think. But again, with losing, I mean, his margins were really rough. I think, you know, that auditor race was like 16 points or something. So, you know, but then we look at, you know, candidates like Bullock lost his first race for AG and then came back and won. So, you know, a much different landscape a long time ago. I think it's really hard to draw parallels because we're in such a different, I think we're talking about the polarized political environment changes things quite a bit. So I think it's hard to kind of say, oh, this happened, you know, 20 years ago and, you know, could happen again. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I've written a couple stories now since I've been in this job about Democrats that have a blue bench program. that works to recruit, at the lowest, city, county level, those kind of races, and then build people up through the legislature. And, there are some Democrats coming back to the legislature that maybe we'll see take a run at statewide office, like Shane has done, coming from a legislative leadership position, jumping into a tier B race. But yeah, and you don't see Democrats quite as much do the model of, Republicans of coming from, I guess we saw Whitney Williams and some people this cycle, but they didn't get through the primary, jump into politics, kind of those higher level races, not coming from the state legislature. But like that was a pretty successful model for John Tester. And I'm curious where they come from, because I know Democrats have been trying to build that bench, but like you guys were talking about earlier, if you don't win those tier B races, that kind of has been a stepping stone for Bullock for sure. Schweitzer didn't follow that model too, I guess, but yeah, I think it's kind of rough to say who's out there right now.
One name I would throw out there is Cora Newman, who ran for the Senate. And she was impressive in the debates. I mean, she dropped out of the race, but I thought she made a mark, and she has an impressive resume, extremely articulate person, and has been a very active Democrat since she dropped out of the race too, and been very supportive of other candidates. I'd keep my eye on her. I don't know what her ambitions are, but that's someone who impressed me during the primary season anyway.
Yeah.
And maybe one other word just to, I don't want our Democratic friends to get too depressed about things. I mean, one thing that is worth keeping in mind is that so much of this is contingent on events and what actually happens, and there is always the potential for Republicans to overreach. And all this talk about, oh, this is a mandate, and the voters have spoken, and we got the message. I mean, that is all set up for a potential overreach, and Democrats may well have a chance to make some gains in the face of that. And then the other thing, I think it is hard. I agree with Sally and Holly on those names they threw out, but it is hard to come up with much of a list. But you also never know who's going to catch on fire. And sometimes these people come out of nowhere, and it's a surprise, and you've got this amazing talent. I mean, we don't have to go back very far in history to find examples of this. I mean, just here in this cycle at the national level, Mayor Pete. I mean, who would have ever thought this mayor from some mid to small sized city in Indiana would have the kind of rise that he's had. So there's always a potential for that out there, and you don't always see those things coming.
Rob, I was going to ask, you mentioned a celebrity candidate from the Democrats. Do you think that there is any chance of someone like Brian Schweitzer coming out of the woodwork to make any kind of a run again?
He definitely toyed with the idea of running for Senate. I guess that was 6 years ago, right? It would have been in that against Daines. So and he chose not to do so. And now a number of years have passed. He did have some national ambitions, but gave some interviews that went very poorly. I think one was to the National Journal, which is a great piece. I'm sure you can still find that, just Googling that. But made some just very dismissive comments about gay people, and I think there was some stuff on women too, and so that was a killer nationally. I'm not sure it would necessarily be a killer in Montana, but maybe you hear his name being tossed about a little bit, but I guess that can kind of cut both ways. On the one hand, he was a popular figure, and although, the years are passing. So the more years that pass and it doesn't happen, the farther, into the history books he goes. But it's also kind of a symptom when you're kind of out there grasping for, heroes from the past. That's not a great sign. I mean, maybe it works occasionally, and maybe it could work in a couple of years. But that's not really the way you build a party moving forward for the future, right? You can kind of use it to fill in the gap, but here or there. But it's not a good long-term strategy to be trying to get some figure from the past or some movie star or something like this.
I think that this one will be our final question for the night. Do you think that there will be a shift back to a bipartisan Montana, and when do you think this would happen?
It's been a while since there has been a totally bipartisan Montana, and I think it'll be a while before there is again. I think this election was a resounding endorsement of the Republican agenda, as Republicans do, and I think that's where a lot of Montanans are right now. And the idea that it's going to, in any time in the near future, switch back to being more of a split ticket kind of state, I just don't see it in the near future anyway. That's my day after the election assessment anyway. Holly, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what you guys were saying earlier, that the margins with the races this year for Republicans were really decisive, but this isn't totally out of the blue. Like, in 16, Bullock was the only Democrat statewide to win. All the other Tier Bs went to Republicans. Tester in 18, but if someone was like, they're kind of 2 for 16 over the last big cycles for Democrats. So we've kind of been marching toward this. And then what we're talking about too with increased polarization, I think people are just more and more identifying just with a party, and then that's who you vote for down the ballot. And then before the election, I was talking to some people for a story I wrote about what Republicans might do if they got the majority, and they're saying that at some point, if the Republicans did push an agenda that voters found to not be appealing for whatever reason, you could see that pushback, that swing toward Democrat, but that's a really long swing. It's not like this immediate, something happens in this session and then in the next legislative races you see this flip. It's just not this quick thing. It's kind of a long trajectory. So I think what Sally was saying, this is kind of the path we're going to be on for a while. And who knows? I think COVID might make things hard to understand or predict for a while, but I do think that this is what we're going to see for the next, several cycles probably. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you too, and I've kind of spoken to that earlier, but yeah, I mean, I think short of a major shakeup, and again, that's always possible. Gianforte rubs some people the wrong way. Can always take things a little bit too far. And have a kind of reaction to that. But I think, Democrats are going to have to do some real soul searching here, and reevaluate where they are and what their message has been, and what they're going to present to voters moving forward.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and thank you to all who attended this lecture from the Mansfield Dialogue series. We'd like to encourage you to please join us on November 18th for our next dialogue, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. Thank you all again, and have a great evening.